The product appropriated by the capitalist is a use value, as yarn, for example, or boots. But although boots are, in one sense, the basis of all social progress, and our capitalist is a decided, yet he does not manufacture boots for their own sake. Use value is, by no means, the thing in the production of commodity. Use values are only produced by capitalists because, and insofar as they are the material substratum, the depositories of exchange value. Our capitalist has two objects in view. In the first place, he wants to produce a use value that has a value in exchange. That is to say, an article destined to be sold, a commodity. And secondly, he desires to produce a commodity whose value shall be greater than the sum of the values of the commodities used in its production. That is, of the means of production and the labor power that he purchased with his good money in the open market. His aim is to produce not only a use value, but a commodity also, not only use value, but value, not only value, but at the same time surplus value. It must be borne in mind that we are now dealing with the production of commodities, and that, up to this point, we have only considered one aspect of the process. Just as commodities are, at the same time, use values and values, so the process of producing them must be a labor process, and at the same time, a process of creating value. Let us now examine production as a creation of value. We know that the value of each commodity is determined by the quantity of labor expended on and materialized in it, by the working time necessary, under given social conditions, for its production. This rule also holds good in the case of the product that accrued to our capitalist, as the result of the labor process carried on for him. Assuming this product to be pound of yarn, our first step is to calculate the quantity of labor realized in it. For spinning the yarn, raw material is required, suppose in this case pound of cotton. We have no need at present to investigate the value of this cotton, for our capitalist has, we will assume, bought it at its full value, say of 10 shillings. In this price, the labor required for the production of the cotton is already expressed in terms of the average labor of society. We will further assume that the wear and tear of the spindle, which, for our present purpose, may represent all other instruments of labor employed, amounts to the value of. If then 24 hours labor, or 2 working days, are required to produce the quantity of gold represented by 12 shillings, we have here, to begin with, 2 days' labor already incorporated in the yarn. We must not let ourselves be misled by the circumstance that the cotton has taken a new shape, while the substance of the spindle has to a certain extent been used up. By the general law of value, if the value of pounds of yarn equals the value of pounds of cotton plus the value of a whole spindle, if the same working time is required to produce the commodities on either side of this equation, then pounds of yarn are an equivalent for pounds of cotton together with 1/4 of a spindle. In the case we are considering, the same working time is materialized in the pound of yarn on the one hand and in the pounds of cotton and the fraction of a spindle on the other. Therefore, whether value appears in cotton, in a spindle, or in yarn, makes no difference in the amount of that value. The spindle and cotton, instead of resting quietly side by side, joined together in the process, their forms are altered, and they are turned into yarn, but their value is no more affected by this fact than it would be if they had been simply exchanged for their equivalent in yarn. The labor required for the production of the cotton, the raw material of the yarn, is part of the labor necessary to produce the yarn, and is therefore contained in the yarn. The same applies to the labor embodied in the spindle, without whose wear and tear the cotton could not be spun. Hence, in determining the value of the yarn, or the labor time required for its production, all the special processes carried on at various times and in different places, which were necessary, first to produce the cotton and the wasted portion of the spindle, and then with the cotton and spindle to spin the yarn, may together be looked on as different and successive phases of one and the same process. The whole of the labor in the yarn is past labor, and it is a matter of no importance that the operations necessary for the production of its constituent elements were carried on at times which, referred to the present, are more remote than the final operation of spinning. If a definite quantity of labor, say 30 days, is requisite to build a house, the total amount of labor incorporated in it is not altered by the fact that the work of the last day is done 29 days later than that of the first. Therefore, the labor contained in the raw material and the instruments of labor can be treated just as if it were labor expended in an earlier stage of the spinning process, before the labor of actual spinning commenced. The values of the means of production, the cotton and the spindle, which values are expressed in the price of 12 shillings, are therefore constituent parts of the value of the yarn, or, in other words, of the value of the product. Two conditions must nevertheless be fulfilled. First, the cotton and spindle must concur in the production of a use value. They must in the present case become yarn. Value is independent of the particular use value by which it is born, but it must be embodied in a use value of some kind. Secondly, the time occupied in the labor of production must not exceed the time really necessary under the given social conditions of the case. Therefore, if no more than lb of cotton be requisite to spin lb of yarn, care must be taken that no more than this weight of cotton is consumed in the production of lb of yarn, and similarly with regard to the spindle. Though the capitalists have a hobby and use a gold instead of a steel spindle, yet the only labor that counts for anything in the value of the yarn is that which would be required to produce a steel spindle, because no more is necessary under the given social condition. We now know what portion of the value of the yarn is owing to the cotton and the spindle. It amounts to 12 shillings, or the value of 2 days' work. The next point for our consideration is, what portion of the value of the yarn is added to the cotton by the labor of the spinner? While the laborer is at work, his labor constantly undergoes a transformation. From being motion, it becomes an object without motion. From being the labor working, it becomes the thing produced. At the end of 1 hour's spinning, that act is represented by a definite quantity of yarn. In other words, a definite quantity of labor, namely that of 1 hour, has become embodied in the cotton. We say labor, the expenditure of his vital force by the spinner, and not spinning labor because the special work of spinning counts here, only so far as it is the expenditure of labor power in general, and not in so far as it is the specific work of the spinner. In the process we are now considering it is of extreme importance that no more time be consumed in the work of transforming the cotton into yarn than is necessary under the given social condition. If under normal, average social conditions of production, a pound of cotton ought to be made into b pounds of yarn by 1 hour's labor, then a day's labor does not count as hours' labor unless a pound of cotton have been made into b pounds of yarn, for in the creation of value, the time that is socially necessary alone counts. Not only the labor, but also the raw material and the product now appear in quite a new light, very different from that in which we viewed them in the labor process pure and simple. The raw material serves now merely as an absorbent of a definite quantity of labor. By this absorption it is in fact changed into yarn, because it is spun, because labor power in the form of spinning is added to it, but the product, the yarn, is now nothing more than a measure of the labor absorbed by the cotton. If in 1 hour divided by pounds of cotton can be spun into divided by pound of yarn, then pounds of yarn indicate the absorption of hours' labor. Definite quantities of product, these quantities being determined by experience, now represent nothing but definite quantities of labor, definite masses of crystallized labor time. They are nothing more than the materialization of so many hours or so many days of social labor. We are here no more concerned about the facts that the labor is the specific work of spinning, that its subject is cotton and its product yarn, than we are about the fact that the subject itself is already a product and therefore raw material. If the spinner, instead of spinning, were working in a coal mine, the subject of his labor, the coal, would be supplied by nature. Nevertheless, a definite quantity of extracted coal, a hundredweight for example, would represent a definite quantity of absorbed labor. We assumed, on the occasion of its sale, that the value of a day's labor power is 3 shillings, and that 6 hours' labor is incorporated in that sum, and consequently that this amount of labor is requisite to produce the necessaries of life daily required on an average by the laborer. If now our spinner, by working for 1 hour, can convert divided by pounds of cotton into divided by pounds of yarn, t follows that in 6 hours he will convert pound of cotton into pounds of yarn. Hence, during the spinning process, the cotton absorbs 6 hours' labor. The same quantity of labor is also embodied in a piece of gold of the value of 3 shillings. Consequently, by the mere labor of spinning, a value of 3 shillings is added to the cotton. Let us now consider the total value of the product, the pounds of yarn. 2.5 days' labor has been embodied in it, of which 2 days were contained in the cotton and in the substance of the spindle worn away, and half a day was absorbed during the process of spinning. This 2.5 days' labor is also represented by a piece of gold of the value of 15 shillings. Hence, 15 shillings is an adequate price for the pound of yarn, or the price of 1 pound is 8 pence. Our capitalist stares in astonishment. The value of the product is exactly equal to the value of the capital advanced. The value so advanced has not expanded, no surplus value has been created, and consequently money has not been converted into capital. The price of the yarn is 15 shillings, and 15 shillings were spent in the open market upon the constituent elements of the product, or, what amounts to the same thing, upon the factors of the labor process. 10 shillings were paid for the cotton, 2 shillings for the substance of the spindle worn away, and 3 shillings for the labor power. The swollen value of the yarn is of no avail, for it is merely the sum of the values formerly existing in the cotton, the spindle, and the labor power. Out of such a simple addition of existing values, no surplus value can possibly arise. These separate values are now all concentrated in one thing, but so they were also in the sum of 15 shillings, before it was split up into 3 parts by the purchase of the commodity. There is in reality nothing very strange in this result. The value of 1 pound of yarn being 18 if our capitalist buys pound of yarn in the market, he must pay 15 shillings for them. It is clear that, whether a man buys his house ready-built, or gets it built for him, in neither case will the mode of acquisition increase the amount of money laid out on the house. Our capitalist foresaw this state of things, and that was the cause of his laughter. The laborer therefore finds in the workshop the means of production necessary for working, not only during 6, but during 12 hours. Just as during the 6 hours process are pound of cotton absorbed 6 hours labor and became pound of yarn, so now pounds of cotton will absorb hours labor and be changed into pound of yarn. Let us now examine the product of this prolonged process. There is now materialized in this pound of yarn the labor of 5 days, of which 4 days are due to the cotton and the lost steel of the spindle, the remaining day having been absorbed by the cotton during the spinning process. Expressed in gold, the labor of 5 days is 30 shillings. This is therefore the price of the pound of yarn, giving as before 18 as the price of a pound. But the sum of the values of the commodities that entered into the process amounts to shilling. The value of the yarn is shilling. Therefore the value of the product is divided by greater than the value advanced for its production. Shillings have been transformed into shillings. A surplus value of shillings has been created. The trick has at last succeeded. Money has been converted into capital. Every condition of the problem is satisfied, while the laws that regulate the exchange of commodities have been in no way violated. Equivalent has been exchanged for equivalent. For the capitalist as buyer paid for each commodity, for the cotton, the spindle, and the labor power its full value. He then did what is done by every purchaser of commodities. He consumed their use value. The consumption of the labor power, which was also the process of producing commodities, resulted in pound of yarn having a value of shilling. The capitalist, formerly a buyer, now returns to market as a seller of commodity. He sells his yarn at 18 a pound, which is its exact value. Yet for all that he withdraws shillings more from circulation than he originally threw into it. This metamorphosis, this conversion of money into capital, takes place both within the sphere of circulation and also outside it, within the circulation, because conditioned by the purchase of the labor power in the market, outside the circulation, because what is done within it is only a stepping stone to the production of surplus value, a process which is entirely confined to the sphere of production. Thus tout est pour l'ami dans le meilleur des mondes possible. By turning his money into commodities that serve as the material elements of a new product, and as factors in the labor process, by incorporating living labor with their dead substance, the capitalist at the same time converts value, past, materialized, and dead labor into capital, into value big with value, a live monster that is fruitful and multiplied. If we now compare the two processes of producing value and of creating surplus value, we see that the latter is nothing but the continuation of the former beyond a definite point. If on the one hand the process be not carried beyond the point, where the value paid by the capitalist for the labor power is replaced by an exact equivalent, it is simply a process of producing value. If, on the other hand, it be continued beyond that point, it becomes a process of creating surplus value. If we proceed further and compare the process of producing value with the labor process, pure and simple, we find that the latter consists of the useful labor, the work, that produces use value. Here we contemplate the labor as producing a particular article. We view it under its qualitative aspect alone, with regard to its end and aim. But viewed as a value-creating process, the same labor process presents itself under its quantitative aspect alone. Here it is a question merely of the time occupied by the laborer in doing the work, of the period during which the labor power is usefully expended. Here, the commodities that take part in the process do not count any longer as necessary adjuncts of labor power in the production of a definite, useful object. They count merely as depositories of so much absorbed or materialized labor. That labor, whether previously embodied in the means of production or incorporated in them for the first time during the process by the action of labor power, counts in either case only according to its duration. It amounts to so many hours or days as the case may be. Moreover, only so much of the time spent in the production of any article is counted, as, under the given social conditions, is necessary. The consequences of this are various. In the first place, it becomes necessary that the labor should be carried on under normal conditions. If a self-acting mule is the implement in general use for spinning, it would be absurd to supply the spinner with a distaff and spinning wheel. The cotton, too, must not be such rubbish as to cause extra waste in being worked, but must be of suitable quality. Otherwise, the spinner would be found to spend more time in producing a pound of yarn than is socially necessary, in which case the excess of time would create neither value nor money. But whether the material factors of the process are of normal quality or not depends not upon the laborer, but entirely upon the capitalist. Then again, the labor power itself must be of average efficacy. In the trade in which it is being employed, it must possess the average skill, handiness, and quickness prevalent in that trade, and our capitalists took good care to buy labor power of such normal goodness. This power must be applied with the average amount of exertion and with the usual degree of intensity, and the capitalist is as careful to see that this is done, as that his workmen are not idle for a single moment. He has bought the use of the labor power for a definite period, and he insists upon his rights. He has no intention of being robbed. Lastly, and for this purpose our friend has a penal code of his own, all wasteful consumption of raw material or instruments of labor is strictly forbidden, because what is so wasted represents labor superfluously expended, labor that does not count in the product or enter into its value. We now see that the difference between labor, considered on the one hand as producing utilities, and on the other hand as creating value, a difference which we discovered by our analysis of a commodity, resolves itself into a distinction between two aspects of the process of production. Process of production, considered on the one hand as the unity of the labor process and the process of creating value, is production of commodities, considered on the other hand as the unity of the labor process and the process of producing surplus value. It is the capitalist process of production, or capitalist production of commodity. We stated on a previous page that in the creation of surplus value it does not in the least matter whether the labor appropriated by the capitalist be simple, unskilled labor of average quality or more complicated, skilled labor. All labor of a higher or more complicated character than average labor is expenditure of labor power of a more costly kind, labor power whose production has cost more time and labor, and which therefore has a higher value than unskilled or simple labor power. This power being higher value, its consumption is labor of a higher class, labor that creates in equal times proportionally higher values than unskilled labor does. Whatever difference in skill there may be between the labor of a spinner and that of a jeweler, the portion of his labor by which the jeweler merely replaces the value of his own labor power does not in any way differ in quality from the additional portion by which he creates surplus value. In the making of jewelry, just as in spinning, the surplus value results only from a quantitative excess of labor, from a lengthening out of one and the same labor process, in the one case, of the process of making jewels, in the other of the process of making yarn. But on the other hand, in every process of creating value, the reduction of skilled labor to average social labor, 1 day of skilled to 6 days of unskilled labor, is unavoidable. We therefore save ourselves a superfluous operation and simplify our analysis by the assumption that the labor of the workman employed by the capitalist is unskilled average labor,